go. So before we get into things, I would like to recognize a few of our founding members of the Atlantic Women's Venture Foundation, which is we like to call the AWVF. We have our three Sandpiper general partners, Rhiannon Davies, Kathy Bennett, and Sarah Young, and our chair of the AWVF Board of Directors, Shannon McDonald, and they'll be joining us shortly. So today's event is hosted by both the AWVF and Sandpiper Ventures. The Atlantic Women's Venture Foundation helps women entrepreneurs connect with people, organizations, and investors. Working in collaboration with Sandpiper Ventures, they aim to increase the number of female funders through education and connection. Sandpiper is a women-led venture capital firm based here in Canada's East Coast, providing a platform where women investors and founders can radically disrupt the venture capital environment. Sandpiper invests in women-led startups in Atlantic Canada and across the country. Both organizations have come together to create this education series to offer expert knowledge to female founders on their entrepreneurial journey. We'll start with a 20-minute presentation from our speaker, Jennifer, and then I'll open the floor for questions at the end. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or you can go ahead and use the raise hand emoji and turn on your camera and go ahead and ask the question. So now what we're here for, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Laplante. She's the Executive Director of Deep Sense, an organization focused on driving economic growth through increased comprehension and adoption of artificial intelligence in the Canadian ocean sector. She holds an MBA and an MSc in computing and data analytics. She's an active member of her community, sitting on the board of directors of the Halifax Harbour Bridges Commission, a member of the board of directors and chair of the Audit and Finance Committee for Arthritis Society, and is vice president of the Victoria Hall Society Board of Directors. She has served as a member of the nominating committee for the Canadian Internet Registration Authority and a member of the Government of Canada's AI Public Awareness Working Group. She is a co-organizer of the Halifax chapter of Women in Machine Learning and Data Science, a global organization that aims to support and promote women and gender minorities who are practicing, studying, or are interested in the fields of machine learning and data science. Jennifer was named one of Data IQ 2021 Top 100 Influential People in AI. Thank you, Jennifer, for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, I'm going to go ahead and give you the reins. So I'm going to stop sharing and you can go ahead and start us off.
Great. One thing I did just notice, hello everyone, is that Zoom has the ability to say slow down. And when I get excited, I tend to speak quickly. So please feel free to use the slow down icon, whatever it turns into. Here we go. Okay, so hello. I love talking about data. This is really exciting. And I love talking about what it is, how you can use it, all of these things. This is what we're going to cover off today. What is data? Some common practices, collecting data, storing data, and then probably the most important thing is eventually taking advantage of that data. You collect it, you spend all this time and money. How can you use it to your advantage? Well, first, what is data and what is it really? It's all about units of information. And it's all about this whole process we're going to go through about data. You use data pieces, numbers, figures, images. You're going to turn it into information that turns into knowledge, and you can make decisions, take actions with this. And the really big piece here that we're going to talk about is no matter what you do, if you don't set that foundation up correctly, you'll never be able to take advantage of that data. And so this is all about setting up the foundation. And I'm sure hopefully there'll be some questions about different examples that I might not cover off, but we'll make sure we really get back to the fundamental pieces. You need to set that foundation right so you can really scale and grow it in the future. So data, I think of everything as data: numbers, facts, information, graphics, all sorts of different things can be data. And so that means every organization, regardless of what your background is, what your role is, where you're coming from and where you're going, everybody's going to have something a little bit different. It's going to have a little bit of a different design, a look and feel, but it all comes down to data. And the biggest thing here is no matter how big you are, what sector you're from, data is one of your biggest assets. So you might own some trucks because you do service calls to customers, or you might be selling some physical products and have a massive inventory. The data is still a really big component of who you are and what you are as a company. That proprietary information is super important to you, and it's going to be how you grow your business. We use data so that we can manage your people. You can manage your time independently, your inventory, your resources, your relationships, and your brand. All of these things come down to different touch points of data. And one of the questions might be, well, what's the most important piece? All of these aspects are going to depend upon who you are, where you are in the life cycle of your business, and what you're selling, what you're trying to grow, what you're trying to do. So one of these will be really important to you. One of them might not be, but these are how different organizations use data. Lots of people run into challenges with data. And how? Well, maybe it's not timely. Maybe somebody only collects data once a week, once a month. They get information from their customers a year later. It's not really timely sometimes. It can be hard to access. And we're going to get into a bit of why that can be hard to access. Is it stored in the wrong place? Is it just that it's the wrong format? Is there something wrong with it? The quality. Can you trust the data that you're currently using? Maybe it's not complete. We're going to talk a little about how do you ensure there's complete comprehensiveness of that data? And then the consistency as well. These are all some of those things that we want to make sure you tackle from the beginning or fix now so that you don't have to deal with it down the road. Data management is all about managing your people, your processes, and your technology. And you have to cover off all of these to make sure that your data is in a good format, in a good way, is accessible, and humans are in the loop for all of this. If your technology fails, you're losing it. And if you don't have the great processes for it, you're going to miss out on it. As we go around this circle, some of these things are going to keep coming up, and we'll reference back to something like this. You need to first make sure you have it. So it's being collected and it's being stored. You need to make sure you can access it. So can you get it out? Is there a segregation of duties in terms of making sure the wrong person isn't accessing information or doesn't access it after they've left your organization, which is also another problem? Do you know it? What kind of rules are in place to make sure you know what a sale is? And I spent a number of years at Atlantic Lottery. And one of the things I remember was we always had these things around data dictionaries and lists of what data meant. And sales can have so many different versions. Is it your net sales? Is it your gross sales? What is it? And so when someone's talking about something, how do you ensure that you have specific rules and language and things so that as you onboard new employees, they understand what you're talking about? Or as you have customers that come on and want to use one of your products or understand it, is there consistent language that you're using internally and externally? And then the big thing is how to use it. Is it available? Is your data available? Do people in your team know how to use it? Is it accessible? And the fundamental piece in the middle, which is your trust. Is there good quality? Is there security around it? Has it been compromised? So all of these factors are super important in making sure that you can use your data appropriately. As we move into thinking about collecting and storing that data, there's two really big important pieces here around structured data and unstructured data. Your structured data, I want you to think your Excel spreadsheet. You've got rows and columns. It's very clear. Maybe it's that you've used a Google Sheet or some kind of like survey on SurveyMonkey. You've forced categories and responses. You know specifically what this is. Maybe it's your general ledger. All of these things are very structured. But there's also lots of data out there that's unstructured. And if you go and talk to some tech folks, they might be like, oh, sure, you can collect all sorts of data. You can store it in so many different ways. And there's different, without getting too deep in the weeds of data, there's structured data, which can be SQL databases or Postgres databases, in case anyone's familiar. And then you move over into the unstructured, and you could have NoSQL, or you can have MongoDB. These are other databases that can store lots of data. And as you're thinking about growing your business, you really want to think about what you're storing and why. Because later on, if you want to go back and use some of that, it might be really hard for you to access if you've got all of this unstructured data lumped in with your structured data. So if you think it through, it might save you a bit of time. When we talk about all sorts of different types of data that are out there, here's examples. You could have time series data. So maybe you have a store or a restaurant or some kind of a business where you have data that has transactions over time, and it's series over time. So maybe you can see the life cycle of things based on seasonality. Maybe you can look at it by time of day and day of week. It's that you see these patterns over time. Data is still a video file, an audio file, or an image. All of this can be really important because maybe there might be something. Right now I work in the ocean sector, and we look at like aquaculture. You can use images of underwater nets that hold pens of fish. You can use images that look at corrosion on underwater pipes. You can also use images if you have, you are self-driving cars. Like all of these things are using images. And so they all are getting trained for one specific purpose, but everybody sees those differently, but they're valuable to their own company. Other versions that can be really important to you as well might be server logs. Maybe you want to know visitation to your websites, some of your social media data. All of this is all data that can be really important to you. You have to think about how you use it, how you store it, how you access it. Is it worth you storing? Is another problem. Now, moving on over into weather data. These are some things that maybe are data that aren't necessarily important to you today, but they might become important. So sometimes you might have your own data, let's say time series data around your sales, but weather data becomes really important and there's third-party data you bring forward. So the data that you're using doesn't necessarily have to be something you own and maintain. You could be taking some third-party data. Maybe you want to compare average temperatures in Halifax based on your ice cream sales. So some of these things are really important, and you have to think about the bigger picture too around the data that you'll want to start collecting over time, because maybe you don't want to have to go and do a dump of website data every year. Maybe you want to have a way that you scrape a website and have it automatically feed into one of your files every day, and you get the highest temperature. And so you never have to go back and collect that data again. You just pull it from somewhere. So there's lots of different ways to access data, and it's just all about expanding your idea to what data is and what it can look like. For some of the data too, you can think about discrete data. So you have very specific numbers that are, continuous, for example, temperature. But then the other thing to think about, things like your postal code. Those are also really important data pieces. And if you did a survey with your customers, those are really important data pieces. And so all of the things that we're going to cover off, we're thinking about making sure that you've thought through how you're collecting it, how you're storing it, how you're using it. And if you're going to use it in the future, are you going to change the way you collect some of this data? So let's say you're asking customer satisfaction over time. And if you go and change that question down the road, can you actually compare those questions? And so some of these pieces, you're thinking about the long-term play of your zip code, postal code might make sense, because in theory, that's not going to change. It's going to be a pretty standard function. You might realize you don't need the 6 character digits. Maybe you only want the FSA, which is the first 3 down the road. But all of these things are thinking about the information that you'll want to collect. One thing that I want you to do right now is I want you to write down in the chat, but you'll have to write it quickly without looking at other people. And what I want you to do is to write down today's date. Feel free. There's no wrong answers. All right, Sean, May 8th. Okay, Leslie, May 18th, 2020. All right, have a look. What are you seeing? So I see some commas. I see May. I see some backslashes. I see some without years. Yeah, and I see some slashes for everything. There's a lot of versions here. I see a day, month, year, a day, month. Do you see a month, day? A day, month, year in different formats. Year, month, day. Excellent. So different formats. So imagine you're collecting data, you're collecting customer data, and you say to your staff, just make sure you record the sales dates. Just make sure we record the service dates of something. Well, what can happen? You can end up having a pile of different versions. And when you go to analyze this data and chart it out over time, you're going to end up with this fragmented input, kind of like what we just saw there. It's not that it's wrong. It's just that there wasn't consistency laid out. And so one of the things you really want to think about is as you start collecting data, or if you've already got some, reformatting it maybe to make sure that you have a usable format that's consistent so people can use it. And I just lost my mouse, sorry. So here's another example. You have an Excel spreadsheet. You have an Excel spreadsheet with first name.
I just had my.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought that was me. You have an Excel spreadsheet with first names, last names. There's all sorts of different functionality that you can do that stays within the domain of you being able to split your data down to the lowest level and then putting it together later on. Because there's nothing worse than you having to go and try to separate cells and data when there isn't nice clear markers. And so, for example, one of my favorite Excel functions is concatenate, where you put together different columns and rows. And so it's all about just thinking about the structure you have for your data, including phone numbers. Do you include dashes? Do you include brackets? I know it kind of seems like a silly kind of thing to bring up, but it's all about thinking about the fundamentals of what you're collecting and why you're collecting it and how you're going to use it in the future to make sure that you're collecting it in the right way. So some of the things here, a couple of, don't worry, we're not done yet, but some of your first list of takeaways is you want to ensure there's a master list of your data. You want to ensure that all of your business users, other users, all agree with what you're talking about. Use the example of sales, gross sales, net sales, whatever it is that you're talking about, things to the highest level and breaking down and make sure you all agree with it. One thing we kind of didn't get into, but we'll get into a little bit more too, is around locating things. So I just showed you an Excel spreadsheet, and I'm sure everybody has done things where they've gone to look for a file after they saved it and been like, oh my gosh, where did I save that? Right, I know I saved that under. And so part of this is thinking about having consistency in how you use your data. Your data doesn't have to be individual transactions and social media likes. It could be your marketing plan or your social media plan, and that you made edits to it and now you can't find that version anymore. So it's really thinking about consistencies and where you store things. Another thing is to think about your relationships. And so maybe you have a CRM, maybe it's a really lightweight CRM and it's a free version of HubSpot, whatever it is. Maybe it's an Excel spreadsheet, which is what I've definitely done in the past. Sometimes you want to think about what the relationships are, because maybe eventually you're going to have statements of work that you issue against customers. How do you want to link those together? And so making sure that you have a system and a process, a numerical value, a labeling, something that allows you to bring all of those together. If you had a store and you have a POS system, is there a mechanism that you have to link these two together so that you can keep track of things? Maybe it is a daily dump of sales that you upload to something else, but it's thinking about how you can bring all of those pieces of information together to save a lot of manual effort. I use one example here of like Excel to QuickBooks. Maybe you start as a really small business and you just simply use Excel to manage time cards and hours and eventually move to QuickBooks. You just really want to think about the processes you've established. Maybe your employees send you an hourly submission every week about their hours. You want to ensure that as you move to more formal systems, you have some kind of mechanism in place that doesn't really change things too much. And as you grow your business, you really want to think about how you're going to onboard new people. How do they understand the process you had? One of the beautiful things about startups and new companies is they're fast because they don't have process. But then until you have that next level employee come on and you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, we don't have a process for this. And so you want to have something documented for some of these. So thinking about the data as you grow to make sure you can add on. Those new members, you want to make sure also your new members, they adopt what you've outlined, because this is kind of like, no, you need to do this because this is a requirement for you. Instead, you have people who circumvent rules, who kind of don't always follow through. You just want to make it pretty clear. And then the other thing is like, how do you add new things? If you had a net new product, how do you add it? So maybe you have a store and you sell products, gift cards, something. How do you make sure that you differentiate those categories of products so that when you're doing your sales analysis, you know what product that was? If you're adding in new customers, how do you make sure you have a system that inputs this in new every time, but in a good, nice, consistent way? Labeling, one quick example of labeling here is like the nightmares of files and things like that. As you're thinking about the information you store, this isn't, again, back-end systems. This might be more, documents, proposals to customers, things you might not have in an online platform. Thinking about how you label them so you can find those labels and find that information. Really thinking about listing, numbering, putting dates in order, trying to make sure that as you grow your business, other people can find things too. We're going to talk about the blue screen of death. And I'm a Windows user, so I apologize to Mac users, but this happens with Windows users. It also happens with lots of other different third-party sources, other types of platforms. You can never assume things are going to work. That means you need to ensure you have copies of your data. There's 3 versions. You want to have it here. You want to have that local copy, an external copy near. So maybe that's a weekly, bi-weekly data dump that goes to a hard drive. And maybe it's only the essential things like your customer lists, your latest statements of work, an output and a dump of your GL. It's something that you make sure that you have an external, and then the far away is the remote version. That could be cloud. That could be you doing another dump of a hard drive and you put it at an office or at home or at your accountant's house. It's all about thinking through how do you ensure that the local version doesn't get destroyed and it's not your only version. The last thing you want is your business to completely get destroyed because you lost a database, you lost a list, you lost a laptop. Having multiple versions. So regrouping on some of these things, you're going to create a data dictionary, which is a record, consistent record, so that people know what it is. So they know what your data is, what your customers are, what your sales are, what your products are. They can go into any of your data you have stored and know what it is. You have a logical flow of data. You don't have a final version 12. Nope, it's not final if it's version 12. You think about how you label things, how you access things. And the other thing to think about, I'm going to get into it in a sec, is your external storage. If you save every version, you're just adding on the versions and the costs of your storage. And sometimes it might seem free, but eventually it's not going to be free. And so making sure you really stream down, pare down what you're saving, because then you actually might be able to save some costs in the future. When we talk about file names and storage, short, consistent, get rid of those codes. Limit to 30. You don't want any kind of like numerical things. In the future, depending on what you do in the world that I work in AI, if you have @ symbols and other things like that, it makes it really hard to do complex things. Some systems don't allow you to upload and store and use complex file names. So you really want to think about easy to use file names. And then backup. Remember, you have more than one version. It's remote, or in some case, whatever it is, and you back up regularly. Okay, let's talk about other places you might have data. All of these on here are places that you might have data. There's many, many more. And the things to think about: one, access. So I mentioned earlier, who has access to it? Can you trust it? All that good stuff. What happens when you have a summer student that comes on and then they leave? Did you remember to shut that off? Did you have a universal single account and they still have access to it? How do you ensure that you are contained here? There's pieces too. As soon as you start using MailChimp, you're stuck with MailChimp. And so really thinking through who are the vendors and who are the companies that you start using. HubSpot is a fantastic free service. Eventually you might move to paying for it, and it's crazy expensive. So thinking through where you build those processes, the relationships, where your data gets stored are super important. Maybe use Stripe or Square for sales, and that's great. But what happens if all of your backend platform and systems are using that, and eventually there's a cost increase and it's not economical anymore, and now you have to change all of your processes? So thinking through how you can extract some of that data to move somewhere else. All of that data is going somewhere. Lots of other places you can have your systems and process embedded with as well. So you've got Amazon, you've got OneDrive, Google, there's pros and cons to every single one. I have ethical concerns with every single company. So there's no real winner here. But remember, if you're not paying for it, you're the customer. Even when you are paying for it, or if you're not paying for it, you're the product. But even if you are paying for it, that's not always a good thing too. It depends. So Google, for example, they might give you lots of stuff for free, and then all of a sudden they decide they're going to shut it off one day. What does that mean for you? And so it's really thinking through where your things get stored and how you can access it and what volatility you have. When it comes to some systems, let's say you're building some kind of an app, and you have an app and a backend system that your customers use because you're a technology company. And maybe you are actually paying for servers, and maybe the servers are sitting in your office. It doesn't happen as much anymore because cloud growth and is trustworthy, and there's cloud data centers in Canada and things like that. But sometimes certain things are worth you building, and sometimes things are worth you buying from somewhere else. As this all relates back to data too. And so maybe it makes sense for you to go and have some third-party system that you can buy because you don't have to worry about building things yourself. Maybe it's a customer database, a customer backend system, whatever it is. Thinking about the data, sometimes you want to build this, and sometimes you want to buy some of these technology and systems. This is a total can of worms that we won't get into today, but anything around regulations, privacy, record maintenance. I'm not an expert in any of this. There's lawyers. Make sure you have some kind of insurance coverage. Follow your insurance coverage if you ever have a breach, because your insurance coverage could say you shouldn't have done that. You should have called us first. Know where your customers are, because that's going to determine what you need to do in terms of protecting them and their data. Depending on where you are, you might have to maintain your records for longer, depending on the kind of product or service you sell. And so you're obviously going to need tax records, but there might be some other elements that you need to keep from transactional standpoint that are super important as well. I'll go back to the world of lottery and gaming, where I spent a long time. We had to keep 7 years of records. Doesn't mean we had to keep them live and accessible at one point, but it just meant you needed to be able to access them. And so really this whole thing is a big can of worms that is a different day. Let's talk about how you take advantage of your data. Okay. It's a really good quote here from Scott Taylor. Good decisions you make on bad data are just bad decisions you don't know about yet. So if you don't have good data, your fundamentals in the back end aren't good, you're missing some sales data, you're missing some information about your customers, you really only have good profiles of half of your customers, yet you're trying to forecast sales based on half of your customers. All sorts of these things you need a good comprehensive view of your data. And then when we talk about taking advantage of it, what does that mean? I want you to really just pay attention to the bottom half of this. These are things around data. First, you want to know what happened. This is all about you and your business first, knowing what happened. You're going to use data to figure it out. Why did it happen? Is that next level. You're not always going to know, but eventually, as your business grows, you're going to learn a little bit more about why it happened. My ice cream sales were high because the weather was nice. You're going to learn about what will happen. You're going to be able to predict a little bit more around your inventory and your sales and your forecasting. This gets really tricky in like resourcing. How many people do you need on staff in your store that day? And then eventually, as companies become more and more mature, have more data, they're going to look at what's the best that could happen. So this is Amazon giving you recommendations, or Amazon pushing things to you before you even need it, because it knows, because it's saying what's the best that can happen. The best that can happen is Jennifer is going to buy another box of Sharpie pens because she's probably used them up. And so it's all about trying to eventually move to this point, but your goal first is to knowing what happened and why it happened. Sometimes too, you're taking advantage of data is just graphing your data. It's just using your data and looking at it. And part of this is thinking about who needs to know this stuff. Do you have funders? Are you writing a proposal to a COA? What do you need to tell them? When you give any kind of reports and you meet with Sandpiper, what do you need to make sure you're sharing with them around your customer retention, your expected sales? All of these things are thinking about what data you need and making sure you're focusing effort on reliable, consistent, trustworthy information to report on some of those things. Now, taking advantage of your data, if we were all together, I'd give you a box of Smarties and we'd organize them, because there's so many ways to look at your data and take advantage of it. So you want to think about how you can present your data and how you understand it. And things could be really important to you because data is almost like in the eye of the beholder. So I could maybe do my descending, I could do ascending. I could look at rainbows of colors. I can look at things alphabetically. And then I need to add in some net new data. So when you think about taking advantage of your data, you need to come at it from the way you're coming at it, but also think about the way other people might come at it and how you need to present it. So I don't know if anybody here uses Strava or Garmin or other things. Some of these apps are really great because they push information to you in a really consumable way. And so guaranteed they've got customer feedback and they're giving you information, but it's all about graphing and using data so that people can make decisions with it. One of the biggest things I talk to a lot of companies about is this, and it's the ugliest graph I know, but whatever, I built it. So here we are. You're going to start with leadership. As your company grows, you're going to know what your problems are. But at the bottom, you're going to have somebody that's helping maintain your data. It is a bit of a data steward. You're an IT person, maybe they're a product person, maybe they're a salesperson. They're going to know what's there, but they're not going to necessarily know what your goals are. And then if you, as the person leading the company, you're going to be like, okay, here's the things that I want to do, but you might not know you have the data to help you make those decisions. And so as a result, you have this gap. And so part of your job as you're growing your business is to make sure there's a really good relationship and alignment there, so you don't get stuck in that chasm and that you don't miss out on opportunities. And so you have big companies that have loads and loads of data, but they don't realize what they can do with it. So maybe you have a bunch of vehicles and you are missing out on having GPS data about your vehicles or tracking around your gas cards. And all of a sudden there's this missed opportunity because you have massive cost increase because your drivers are letting your trucks idle and they're filling up their personal cars and all sorts of other things that are driving up costs. And it's that you didn't know you could get at that data, but you were trying to keep your cost in check. Knowing more about your customers and the frequency of them calling your company and never getting through because no one's answering the phone. I don't know if people make phone calls anymore, but if they did, if you knew that information and you were missing out on calls that didn't get answered, that's really important information for you to know, because maybe you need to add more people answering phones during certain hours of the day. So it's all around knowing what you have and how you can use it. Last slides, I promise. This is my world of AI and machine learning. No expectation that every company is ever going to get here. But the thing to remember is that data is yours as a proprietary organization. This is the thing that you own. It's your huge value. And there may be other ways that you can use it. And there may be other technology out there that can augment how you do things. And so this is just a slap up of basic examples of where you can use data to help you address things. Maybe you can automate some system processes. Maybe you can automate some financial things in the future, customer retention chatbots, things that could take a little bit of pressure off of you that may actually not be that hard to do, but it's still using data and technology to help grow your business. Okay, key points you're going to take away. Data is your differentiator. Your customer list or your customer list, knowing their behavior, all of these things, these are important to you. Make sure you have it. Have a backup. Be ready because somebody's going to make a mistake one day, guaranteed. Consistency is critical. So as you're collecting data about what's happening, making sure you have clear processes, clear rules, and everyone buys in. Knowing that you're going to scale your business too, you're going to have to add more processes, more data, and more rules. Software as a service. So you're looking at HubSpot, you're looking at Google Cloud Storage, that's IT as a service sometimes. All of these are long-term and they're big commitments. So don't just jump in there. Know what you're getting in with. Know what your rules are. Know how much data you're allowed to extract if you end a contract. Know how long they retain that data. Know where it's stored because maybe it's stored in the States and that might become a problem if you have customers in Europe. Use the data that you have and the information you have to make some decisions. Monitor your performance. And the big thing too here about, especially about startups and smaller businesses and as companies grow, you have to build things more than once. Because if you build it to be able to handle you when you're massive, that means you've built it too big and you've spent too much money and too much time. So know that something is probably going to be a bit of a throwaway, but repurpose as much as you can. You don't want to start from scratch with customer databases. You want to migrate things eventually, but know that whatever you make a decision on today isn't at 100 customers, doesn't need to fit 10,000 customers, and know that there's an evolution that's allowed. So think about what you're doing today and knowing that will grow eventually. And that's all I have to share. Feel free to ask questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for that. This morning, I can attest to trying to find some specific document and not knowing where I stored it. And I think for a lot of us, that have customers in whatever industry and whatever product, we kind of sort of overlook the information that we're gathering from that. So I can start with the question because I actually want to know this. And for those of us who started collecting data from our clients, from research that we're doing for businesses, how do you suggest we start to clean up and implement these practices? So if we've started 2-3 months, a year into the journey, and we're not keeping an eye on how we're managing our data, how do you suggest we kind of pause and reevaluate and implement all these wonderful, tools?
I think it starts with what's most important to you. So, if there's something that's going to be something you either monetize or it's going to be impactful and going to help you make decisions to run your business, that's when you should focus on it. If there's information data, like maybe there's stuff, research, for example, things you download, aren't long-term. Maybe you have a temporary file that is a short-term use and that you can eventually delete when a project completes. So it's kind of just thinking through what's really important, creating maybe silos or buckets of information and data to say, all right, here's our customers, here's the customer related data, or here's our operational data. These are the priorities we have, and here's what we need to make sure we have processes on, and here's the pieces we're willing to just let go. So organizing data, for example, like my own personal drive is very different than the shared drive with my team. My shared drive with my team is numerical and we have structure. The junk that I save and the versions that I do, oh my gosh, it's a mess. But that's okay because it's my internal processes. But as a team, here's the things we need to ensure there's consistency and there's scale and shareability with. And so I think it's just thinking through what needs to be used by a bunch of people repeatedly and has inherent value to you as an organization.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Do we have any questions? Feel free to put it in the chat or sort of use the raise hand emoji to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask any questions. We have Hiro.
Yes, yeah. Thank you for all the presentations. As my name is Hiro, and I'm attending at St. Mary's University as an MBA student. I have a question about data cleaning. So let's say that if I start my own business and I can't afford to hire a data engineer, so in case I have to start my own data cleaning processes and like, all the data implementation processes and need to learn all the process by myself, what would be the good sources to learn all the data techniques?
So when you say clean and process your data, can you give me an example of the data types that you're talking about?
For example, like if I have my customer data, and as you discussed earlier, like, if my data are kind of messed up in like in terms of format, then I need to clean and organize my data, and I need to learn the data cleaning techniques by myself. What kind of like learning, um, how to say, like, learning platforms or learning courses would you be able to recommend for me?
I think, to be fair, Google's your friend. Google optimal customer database design. Do a couple of database or customer database or customer records for startups or the type of industry that you're in even, right? It might have very specific nuanced things that you want to think about. One thing is data cleaning is very manual. So even in the world that I'm in, where someone might be building a really complex machine learning AI solution, 80% of the time that is spent on any project is spent on data cleaning. And that's not always avoidable. And it might have been before somebody had done a really great job of labeling and storing the right information. Even then, though, it still takes a long time. So I think it's going through that data and having to fix those records. And sometimes there's ways to execute and actually write code that will help you move this over there, add a space, add a bracket, add a whatever. And if the only tricky thing you might get into is if it's already stored in some other way, you might have to extract it and then augment that data. I think you also really have to think about what's missing and what you need to add. So you might have, let's say you have a database with 100 records, but for some reason you don't have postal code, or you are missing the contact name. You want to think about what you will want in the future too. So looking at what you currently have and then trying to augment it and backfill it later or add as you go. You don't always have to go back and fix everything, just change your processes going forward. So spending time on rebuilding can be a lot, just thinking about how you can clean it. So Google, have a look at this domain specific or business or industry specific type of thing. And one of my favorite things to do sometimes is Googling that term and then hitting images on Google. And then you're going to get visuals back that will give you some nice cues and drill down into articles that might be able to help you structure things.
Okay, yeah, great thanks for the great advice. So let's say if I were like in the food and beverage industry, maybe I would like start Googling, data cleaning tips for the customer data for food and beverage industries, and like probably the cool tips on Google will pop up, right?
Yes, probably, yeah. Or it might give you a platform. Like there might be some service providers out there that have a very standard structured format. Maybe there's certain things you don't need. So maybe you use Square for transaction purposes with customers. Maybe you only need a credit card number and a cell phone number as the information when a receipt gets texted to somebody. So it's sometimes too, you want to think about the risk that you take on about storing data. I am a big fan of only storing as much as you really need to store. So there's just that risk of what happens if there's a data breach and the potential you have for charges and all of those other things. So that we won't get into that one right now. So yeah, Google it and see what you can find.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you for the advice. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Hira, for that question. Do we have any more questions? Ellen. You're on mute there, Ellen.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, this is great. You mentioned something right at the very beginning. Let me get about 5, 6 slides in. Did you call it decognate? It was the slide you showed us where it took Ellen Farrell, St. Mary's University, professor, blah, blah, blah. And it was all just in a line and it turned it into like a format. It separated the Ellen from the Farrell, the first from the last.
Concatenate.
What is it called?
Concatenate. C-O-N-C-A-T. One second. Thank you, Leslie. Concatenate. Yeah, Jean. And you can do something like add a column of blanks. So like add a space bar and then you can concatenate. It's genius when you want to have a really comprehensive, clean database and then you want to merge things. And this, of course, this assumes you're using something like Excel and not necessarily a HubSpot or another third-party CRM or something like that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, so I thank you for that. I remember I had a pile of stuff one day, and so I hired a student to do it, and it came back like in 15 minutes. I was just like, what are you, some sort of a magician? Like, what did you do? All nicely formatted and everything, and it was all correct and accurate and everything. So is that, that's just a command in HubSpot or Excel or something like that?
That one's in Excel, yeah. And I think that's the one where, sometimes it's a good example. What you're raising is sometimes you don't always know the tricks that are out there. And so there's these really fast data transformation tricks that someone knows. And sometimes it's worth reaching out to a student and trying to pay them a couple bucks. Like I know people who've gone and, text to columns in Excel as well, will split text in columns and it will take things and separate them. And I know people who've manually gone and copy and pasted things over rows after rows. So there's a lot of simple data manipulation, and there's a couple of places I recommend to look at. One is Udemy, UDEMY. Another one, or TikTok, there we go. Another one is edX, EDX. It's an app that has really great courses. There might be some really interesting Excel type courses that you can take that will just give you little tricks and tips that you didn't know existed that can really be time savers.
Well, your kind of presentation about the kind of the tidying things up and so on, my way of writing successive documents has been to save as version 15, save as the next day version 16, save as the next day version 17, and I have all the previous versions. So I think I'm going to kind of take that to heart. I don't need to have all of those, and I think I have like something like 11,000 unread emails in my. I think I'm just going to write them off. I know I'm never going to look at them, so I'm getting better now at just getting rid of some of that stuff. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you, Ellen, for that. Do we have any more questions? I see. Okay. I'll go ahead and read Saurav's question. And I don't have much of a tech background, but what I learned of this is how data is responsible and a driver of success for a business. It was great learning about the field and got me interested in data science. They appreciate you taking out time to provide such valuable learnings. I echo that. I feel like this is a field that is very essential, hence the reasons for these series, but can be very easily overlooked. So thank you for that. We have Erin with a question.
Yeah, thank you. I was just about to lower my hand too, because I was just basically going to say the same thing, which is I don't have a specific question, but you've given me so many things to think about. So thank you. I really appreciate that. Our business is in developing a medical device. And so our whole business is data. That is our business. Our asset is the data that's tied to the performance data that we have, and that's very closely tied to the IP. So this is all just getting me thinking about specifically how do we mine those strategic opportunities for data that are already existing in everyone's minds? How do we get those out? So I don't have a specific question for you on that, but if by all means, if you have the answer that's going to solve that problem, please go ahead. But otherwise, thank you. Just really appreciate that presentation.
It's all great. I think the thing to remember too is you're going to make mistakes. You're going to miss out on something. Things will go by and you're like, damn it, why didn't we? But part of it too is you want to make you don't want to make the mistake of storing too much in the beginning, but you also don't want to miss out. And so as you're building those devices, you want to think about the data that comes off of a device. You also want to think about the data like just for decision making for patients, but you also want to think about the data about the device itself too. And so thinking about, I don't know what the device is specifically, but things like timestamps, the frequency of which it emits data, how it emits, time zones. I have lots of different things to think about. But one thing I've run into is where people try to compare two sets of data, one collected data every 30 minutes and one collected every 20 minutes, and then you run into a problem. But yeah, if you ever reach out and we can brainstorm if you want.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yep.
Lynn, you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Jen. So you mentioned, and Ellen said as well, for us people who are more mature and may not have all the fabulous like whiz-bang skills when it comes to Excel and different sorts of data tools. Are you aware of any programs around where students are actually like learning this type of thing and either are available for like co-op terms or maybe like people that the entrepreneurs here can target for new hires or temporary hires?
It's a really good question. I think, and this is, I have to be really careful that I don't slam anybody. Sometimes you can get really great computer science folks, but they don't have business sense. And sometimes you have great business folks that don't have analytical and data sense. And so finding that niche can be really tricky. There's some really great programs. NSCC has some fantastic programs and internship requirements for some of its IT analytics students. They're always looking for examples of class examples for projects and things like that too. A lot of times there's capstones projects. Feel free to reach out. I can share the name of some of the faculty members there. Some of the undergrad students, I'm just thinking, there's some great programs at Dalhousie that are around. It used to be called e-commerce and now it's digital innovation. And sometimes you'll find folks that are really good there. I do think it's an ebb and flow because part of it has to be somebody has to be interested. I look at like my kids and up until a couple of years ago, my son's 15 now, up until a few years ago, maybe a year ago, he didn't know how to save down a file and do things with it because he'd only ever used Chrome and you use Google Sheets, right? So there's all of these things where some kids, there's certain things that are inherently so clear to them and they get, and then there's other things where they're like, wait, how do you save a file? How do I email you a file I just saved? So, you could find some really great talent with certain things, but then there's other stuff they're completely lost on. But I do think, reaching out to some of those institutions are really great. And the one, of course, is like Digital Nova Scotia always has great types of programming and content coming up or they're doing. And they're always in the know of folks who might be looking for some side consulting. So there might be, sometimes it's worth you paying a couple of hours for someone to brainstorm with you to help you think through some of this stuff. And they're a really great resource as well to give you some direction and guidance on who might be able to help too.
Awesome, thank you. And I know there are different types of programs out there from various organizations that can help subsidize stuff like that as well. So yeah. Just gotta find the brain.
Thank you, Lynn, for that. We are coming to the close. I want to just make sure we don't have any other questions and anyone wanting to ask any questions. Okay, it doesn't look like it. I want to say thank you, Jennifer. This was very insightful. We have a lot of topics in our sessions, but I feel like this one is a very essential topic for our founders here. And I want to thank everyone for being here and attending what I think is our 5th session. I know it was supposed to be a 5-part series, but I believe we might have 2 more in the works for you all. So please look out for an email coming out with the details of our next session, a feedback survey, for you to let us know, what we're doing right or what topics that you would like to see in the future. And we're also going to be having a YouTube link with the presentation of this session. So look forward to seeing you all in the next session and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much.
Thanks,